Welcome to The Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Mathews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from forest soundscapes to fragile oceans, from the songs of whales and trees to the secret world of microspecies and microbes. In this season where we are up in the air, my guest in this conversation is Mădălina Diaconu, who researches at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna, Austria. Mădălina does research, amongst other subjects, in environmental aesthetics, urban aesthetics, and phenomenology of perception. This is part one of our conversation where I learned so much about fascinating topics with our very erudite guest. In 2024, she published Aesthetics of Weather, and in this interview, we glided through some of the topics in this extremely interesting book. The conversation looked at the philosophical assumptions, especially in Western traditions, that have hindered an aesthetic theory of weather, such as the ideal of permanence and the dichotomy between nature and culture. For Mădălina, the complexity of the weather experience involves the social, the scientific, and the ethical, all rolled into one. Weather is also an object of sensory experience, and we need to dive into fields that have been overlooked, such as the experience of temperature, the importance of olfaction and smell, and phenomena such as the wind, which are invisible. We tend to center the visual and the solid, while Mădălina reminds us to foreground our other senses and to experience the ethereal materiality and the powerful figuration in the space of the aerial. Reinterpreting the aesthetic as the theory of perception calls for sensitivity and perceptual discernment. The aerial environment does not simply surround us. Its subtle matter permeates bodies and sensitivities and eventually conditions thinking and acting. Quoting from her book, "The human is a hybrid being that switches between the elements, a migrant between different states of matter or dimensions of being. The experience of weather is first and foremost an unplanned encounter with contingency and with the power of elements. The atmosphere is the medium of life, a precondition to our being in the world. Rather than our present stereotypes surrounding the weather, we can begin to appreciate the splendor in ordinary weather conditions and the wonders in everyday life." According to David Macaulay, availability and accessibility are the first characteristics of the beauty of the sky, and treating the air as a perceptual commons is a prerequisite for any collective action we take as a species. The sky belongs to the shared commons. We all live in this atmospheric in-between, on the earth and under the sky. There is probably no experience which is more public than our experiencing of the weather. Our bodies and our atmosphere are two communicating vessels. The feeling of temperature is an example of this. In this conversation, Mădălina reminds us that we are thermic subjects, that our being in the world is an active exchange of caloric energy with the environment. The sense of warmth is primordial. The skin is like a continent that can be charted, and tendencies like vasodilation and vasoconstriction are a microcosm of larger bodily tendencies. Merleau-Ponty describes the body as a hollow, a fold which has been made and can be unmade. We see this through larger tendencies to fold and unfold, open and close, dilate and contract, narrow and expand. Also evident in how we perspire to prevent overheating, a cooling, porous evaporation. While we did not discuss it, the day and night cycle too is one of the empirical processes of appearing and disappearing, concealing and unveiling. So join us with your thermic body and enjoy the fleecy, cloudy edges of our conversation. Mădălina, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our podcast, The Subverse.
Thank you for this invitation.
I'm going to start with the following question. In 2024, you published a wonderful book called Aesthetics of Weather. Your introductory chapter is titled The Many Faces of the Sky. So for me, I think this is a great place to start. Could you tell us more about the many faces of the sky? And also in this answer, if you could tell us more about the weather as an object of sensory experience And if you could also outline some of the key questions you raise in the book about this aerial space that we are immersed in and that we breathe in.
Thank you. This is a huge question. So first of all, this image, the many faces of the sky, is a quotation. I usually avoid visual metaphors because I've been criticizing oculocentrism for more than 25 years at least. But it's at the same time a very generous metaphor, because when you think of the many faces of the sky, the first idea that comes to my mind is that we have to make a difference between the realm of atmosphere and the sky in the sense of space, of cosmic space, because they are very different also in the history of philosophy, not only of science. Meaning that the atmosphere is a field of high dynamics, the field of weather phenomena, in contrast, of course, with the space as such. But in addition to this, the distinction, so between, let's say, the atmospheric space, the physical atmosphere, and cosmic space, I think we should discuss more the atmosphere. So my book is about the aesthetics of weather. It's not about astronomical aesthetics. And when you ask about many faces of the sky, I would say, in the first place, it's a multisensory perception. So it's not an oculocentric, it's not a merely visual one. We all make this experience in our everyday life. And this is also one of the challenges, or also one of the reasons why I wanted to discuss this subject from an aesthetic perspective, because usually we focus on sight and hearing, but each time when we experience the weather, we have a fully, let's say, synesthetic experience of weather phenomena. Of course, we say sometimes we hear the thunder and we see the rain, but we hear the rain and we see the snow, or we smell the coming snow. But basically, each experience of the weather is a multisensory one. And I've been working in the field of aesthetics for more than 35 years now. So since I graduated, and I appropriated this redefinition or reinterpretation of aesthetics as aesthetics, which means a theory of perception. So it's not only or not mainly about beauty. And of course, it's not only about art, but it's perception. It's about a specific kind of perception in the first place. You also asked about the experience of being immersed in what I call the medium atmosphere. It was Husserl who, at the beginning of the 20th century, mentioned that our body, which means our living body, is the 0 point of experience, Nullpunkt der Erfahrung. And Husserl was actually oculocentric because he used so many visual metaphors, horizon and intuition and theory and so on. And this is why I took up his metaphor. But it's not that the weather, meaning the physical atmosphere, is an object in front of us. So we don't have any frontal or any merely dual relationship between an object and a subject, as we used to from the history of Western metaphysics, Western philosophy. But I wrote that actually the weather is also inside us. So it's with us. I mean, my body feels everything and is the 0 point of experience, but at the same time, I cannot say that the weather remains outside. Of course, we are immersed in the weather because the atmosphere is the medium of our life, of our existence. It's not an object of perception in the first place. It's something we need, actually. We need to breathe, we need light, we need temperature in order to survive, really, not as thinking subjects, but as living beings. But at the same time, I like to think that the subject is immersed in this medium of life, and at the same time, a porous being, which means we as subjects communicate with the environment. We have also other vital functions. We have to eat, for example, yes, but we also have to breathe, which means that the air that is outside circulates and enters our body. Some kind of physical exchange. I mean, it's not a metaphor. It's really an objective process. And what we philosophers can do is only interpret these objective processes. And that's why the weather is outside, but also within us, and not only as physical air, as chemical elements, but I can be inside, like right now. I can look outside how the weather is. I feel the coming rain. I cannot do anything against it, simply feel it. I don't know if you suffer from meteor sensitivity, but we really feel it. And you cannot say it's ocular, We cannot even reduce this experience to the classical 5 senses. What kind of feeling is a kind of relief, especially summer in the city when we have many hot days and then the rain comes, and it's this feeling of relief. Yes, you are also outside and the rain is within us, let's say.
I also found another concept which is fascinating, that it's not just a question of beauty, but it's also a question of perception and a question of ethics. And here you speak about the atmosphere as a perceptual commons, that it is both accessible and it is available. So if you could expand a little bit on this subject.
So during the past years, we have lots of discussions, especially in environmental statics, about the concept of commons, which is a concept which comes from political philosophy and from environmental ethics. And regarding the atmosphere or the sky or the air, this is a common resource for all. So it cannot be privatized, we would say, because we simply share the sky. So this means that being immersed in the atmosphere is a very presupposition of perception, not only of life, but of each process of perception. So we say whether it belongs to the commons is accessible. At the same time, we are not allowed to forget that perception is socially, culturally, politically conditioned, which means that, of course, in principle, we all have access to the sky, for example, to image of the sky or to air, but it's different to live in the countryside or live in a metropole where you cannot really see the sky because of the skyscrapers. And of course, it's not the same thing if you live somewhere where during the summer you can have shadow and it's very comfortable. And compared to the situation in which you live somewhere where it's simply very hot during the summer and you have to use air conditioning if you can afford it at the same time. So this brings me, of course, to the reinterpretation of aesthetics, not only as aesthetics, as theory of perception in general, but as a social aesthetics, because there is this social dimension, of course, of our perception. And what we say, yes, we all can breathe, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge the right to breathe the proper air with a proper air quality and the right to have thermic comfort during the summer. So this brings us, of course, to issues of urban aesthetics, political aesthetics, to the difference between better and worse districts and to the conditions of life. So that's why I wanted actually to make this difference between availability, in principle, yes, and accessibility, which is conditioned. And another thing, so this was, let's say, the socio-political dimension of the thing. But at the same time, why do we discuss so frequently about weather, especially about climate nowadays? Because we are simply afraid. We are simply afraid of the fact the atmosphere one day won't be available anymore. And I mean, the atmosphere with a proper air quality, the atmosphere is a medium of life. So if taking the atmosphere for granted for 100,000 of years, not thinking about, not philosophizing on it. And it's not a coincidence that we discuss more about the weather and about climate nowadays, precisely because we have a big question mark regarding precisely this atmosphere nowadays.
Thank you so much, Mădălina, and I completely agree with you. Firstly, for pointing out that, yes, the air may be a commons, but how we experience it, there's great inequality and great difference depending on where you are and where you're placed. And also in terms of how our bodies interact with that atmosphere. Here, I also wanted to ask you about the other use of the word atmosphere, which is feelings. How does the air and atmosphere and how we feel and our emotions, how do you connect these?
The so-called neo-phenomenology of atmosphere, in the sense of ambience, in the sense of an emotionally tuned space, was another starting point for my project about the aesthetics of weather, because especially the German phenomenology of atmosphere, Hermann Schmidt's, Gernot Böhme, meanwhile there is a whole school, they use this concept, but they reinterpret it as the mood one feels in a space. And this is, of course, an intersubjective experience, and this brings all these scholars to focus on the nexus between perception and emotion. So we feel something, but we don't feel some perceptual qualities, but we feel that something is in the air. We feel that the atmosphere is sticky, or we feel relief, as I said, when the rain finally comes. This is what phenomenologists of atmosphere, in the meaning of ambience, they say you have to be present in one place in order to feel that atmosphere. And when we consider that atmosphere is also the physical atmosphere, that we have all this array of atmospheric sciences, the whole history of climate and of geology and of the interplay between the Earth and the atmosphere, then there is a fully different dimension of atmosphere, because this is not an experience which is purely phenomenological, meaning that we make this experience here and now. We can also reflect on this experience. We can reflect on how people thousands of years ago made the experience of the atmosphere. We can also speculate or develop what Emily Brady called speculative imagination, ampliative imagination, just imagining how it was during the world of dinosaurs, what kind of atmosphere was on the Earth before us. And this was also an essential part of my project, because I wanted actually to combine different strands of aesthetic theory. So this phenomenological aesthetics of atmosphere, which retrieves emotions, then Arnold Bullian's aesthetics of engagement, which includes perceptual engagement, but also political engagement, which means also ecological commitment. And also I wanted to include something which neither Bullian nor Gernot Böhm and Hermann Schmitz do, to pay attention to the relevance of science for our aesthetic experience. But this means, of course, that we cannot confine our experience only to perception here and now. We have also to include imagination, cognition, all kinds of cognition, everyday cognition, traditional ecological knowledge, scientific knowledge, not meaning that we have to react to science and say what science tells us. We have to translate it into an aesthetic experience. Science and aesthetic experience have two different values. But I think there is some kind of convergence between aesthetics and scientific knowledge, precisely because of the ethical consideration. And this brings me back to your initial question, because I don't endorse aestheticism. I don't think that we have to discover the beauty of atmosphere and of the average weather conditions in order to enjoy everything. We are not allowed to enjoy everything. We simply cannot enjoy a natural catastrophe. We simply cannot enjoy when species disappear. So my conviction, and I'm not the only one in the field of environmental aesthetics believing in this, that there is some kind of subterranean, implicit, hidden synergy or convergence between the aesthetic and the ethical tenet. We are holistic subjects. There is some kind of communication of vessels between our moral and our aesthetic, let's say, being.
Here, I just had two follow-ups. One is, thank you for talking about the imagination. The second is, when you talked about the senses, I was also thinking about smell, because smell is so associated with memory, considered to be one of the most powerful drivers of memory.
So as an answer to your previous question, I mentioned imagination, which throws us back to the past. But at the same time, we can project ourselves into the future. And this is what at least some artists, some environmentally committed artists do. So imagining how the Earth, how the space will look like after the collapse of civilization, which means also the collapse of humanity. This means after our death. So this is a strange image, because this imagination, it's a posthumous imagination. And it's at the same time somehow paradoxical, because what we can see is what someone imagined, what we can never imagine, because we all will be dead by the time. All right, so I think that art already reacts to these scenarios of environmental grief, of environmental nostalgia, of environmental fear. Regarding smell, smell is a previous topic of mine. So before working on this project on the aesthetics of weather, I was engaged in a large project on urban aesthetics, also from a multisensory perception. And before that, so I wrote my habilitation, which is, let's say, a huge book on the aesthetics of touch, smell, and taste. Because this was back in the 1990s, when I was in my 20s at that time. At that time, they were discovering media aesthetics, and media aesthetics is audiovisual. And I was looking for something different. I was asking myself, what about these so-called lower senses? You know, this is how Hegel and other metaphysicians called these senses. They are lower senses because they connect us to animality. They are instinctive and they cannot be discussed. Or it's a waste of time to discuss them from a philosophical perspective. And one of these three senses was olfaction. And I discovered that this topic actually was fascinating because I had only scarce literature on it. Also because it was biased by all kinds of prejudices. It's primitive, it's feminine. And then trying to outline an olfactory aesthetics, I discovered that we need different categories, which we cannot find in the history of Western oculocentric metaphysics. And in this context, I worked for the first time with the concept of atmosphere also as ambience, because we all know, and biologists have very solid explanations for this, why smells can be perceived, but this perception is at the same time pleasant or unpleasant. So we cannot, let's say, avoid the hedonistic or the pleasure-related dimension of olfaction. And going a step further, smells circulate in the air. So we have this old philosophical explanation. So during the Greek atomism, there are some kind of eidola, some kind of images, or effigies with Lucretius, so some kind of images, some kind of copies, which are smells and which circulate through the ear and reach us, our nostrils, and enter our bodies and so on. But this is a visual metaphor, and there's a whole discussion in olfactory studies whether we have really some kind of mental representations, mental images of smells or not. What happens with our brain when we remember some smells? And coming back to the air, I think that we have to be more courageous. I don't say radical, but more courageous and look for new concepts. So one of these concepts regarding olfaction, smells, air, is the concept of trace. Because smells, let's say, they leave their body, the odorous body, the olfactory body, circulate, and what animals in nature leave behind. So they leave traces. They leave perceivable traces. But what is interesting for me from a philosophical point of view, these traces are not icons, are not iconic signs. So when I feel a trace, for example, when I feel the smell of something, I cannot say that the smell is a copy, is a eidolon, is some kind of homunculus. It's a small image, like a bonsai of a tree. It's a small image of an object or of a phenomenon. There is a kind of correspondence, but it's not an iconic, it's not a mimetic one. And in the history of, once again, of our West, let's say our Western aesthetics, we've been using since Plato and Aristotle the concept of mimesis as a kind of imitation, but we don't have an imitation in this situation. So we have trace, and the trace is extremely evocative. So it's, as you say, very powerful, including emotionally. And of course, this trace can activate some kind of visual memories, but not always. So if I don't know the smell, or think of artificial fragrances of perfumes, what am I supposed to see? Am I supposed to see the perfume bottle? Am I supposed to see what? Some perfumes are really abstract. So this is some kind of connection between olfaction and trace and air. And yes, in the case of the weather, we have also smellscapes. And these smellscapes also induce or awaken us certain moods, so certain atmospheres, certain emotional ambiences.
I'd like to move on, Mădălina, to sections of your book which I learned so much from. I call them the two T's. The first is temperature and the other is tornadoes. Two different subjects, but fascinating ones. And I'd like to start with the experience of temperature. Specifically, how the thermic is often overlooked in aesthetics and phenomenology. If you could tell us more about this.
The sense of temperature is usually assigned or subsumed to tactility, so to the sense of touch, which is a huge sense because it also implies kinesthesia and, according to some scholars, also the sense of pain. So it's a very complex sense. And implies, of course, also tactile qualities as when we touch something. I think that temperature deserves a special mention or a special theory. And it's very difficult to find interpretations of temperature in the history of philosophy. It's funny that when I presented for the first time this topic, phenomenology of temperature, there was a conference on phenomenology, and I tried to find some names in the predecessors, some names in the history of philosophy who at least occasionally mentioned the temperature. And at the end of this presentation, I was drawn the attention by a participant to anthroposophy, which is not something I was acquainted with, but it seems that they have a whole theory regarding the importance of cosmic temperature. So it's very difficult to find useful theoretical sources. But I don't know, if we want to search in the history of philosophy for such interpretations, of course, we can find the episode in Descartes with seeing the flame, the light of a candle and touching that candle. And these are, of course, two different kind of perceptions which address in principle the same object, but they imply two different accesses, let's say, to the same object. Because, of course, the light of a candle, it's not dangerous, whereas if we try to touch the candle, it can burn us. What implications, say, a philosophical interpretation of thermic experience can have for philosophy in general and then for aesthetics? And so my claim is that it leads us to different structures of the subject. So in philosophy, at least in phenomenology, we say that there are different kind of temporality, of spatiality, so which means special structures, different structures of the subject corresponding to different sensory modes. And then, of course, I ask myself, all right, which are the structures of the thermic subject? And for example, to take up again the example of sight. In the case of sight, let's say we have these eyes and we have a frontal object more or less in front of us, or peripheral, but anyway, we are not immersed in the subject. And we have only these two sensory organs, which are the eyes. But in the case of temperature, we have the whole body, we have the whole epidermis, we have the whole extension, let's say, of the skin. So from the outset, we don't have two laser beams on the object, but we are embedded, let's say, in the subject. And of course, we have points on the skin which are more sensible than others to thermic stimuli. But this is a very different structure, the thermic subject, than the visual subject. So the thermic subject has extension. Not only that, I had also 2 or 3 different structures or features which I introduced for the thermic subject. The second is the depth, which means the depth of the flesh, to use also the French of Merleau-Ponty, because I work with biological studies which show that the temperature of our body at the extremities is different than within our brain and within our chest. So we are not only extended subjects, Rex extensa again with Descartes, but we have also really depth, and which means we have a known thermic space which has different thermic structures. So within us, not only outside, but also within this internal space of ours. And then, which is the limit, which is the boundary, let's say, of the thermic subject? Because I have a cat and you don't have to touch it. Of course, the cat has a few degrees more than a human. You don't have to touch her to feel her temperature. But we all make this experience in our everyday life, in crowded means of transportation and on erotic situations. And of course, this experience, feeling the temperature, feeling the warmth of a living body, living human or animal body, close to us, this also can be pleasant or unpleasant, of course, depending on the relationship with this person. So I interpreted this extended thermic boundary of our body as a kind of aura, not in a categorical and not in a esoteric sense. I am a philosopher and I'm very cautious, but aura is a concept that was used also by Walter Benjamin in the 1930s. It's very common in aesthetics, meanwhile was used also by Tom Leddy in everyday aesthetics. So aura meaning that we emanate something. Of course, we emanate warmth as long as we live. And that's why every living body or every human subject as a thermic subject emanates, spreads temperature.
You also talked about Merleau-Ponty, and he refers to the body as a hollow or as a fold. And there were 2 concepts, which is the bodily tendencies we have to narrow and to expand, the epicritic and the protopathic.
It was actually Hermann Schmitz who introduced these concepts of epicritical and protopathic for tendency of the living body. And you can see that, for example, in the case of breathing, you know how our chest moves when we inhale and then exhale, but we can use it also somehow metaphorically when we feel a pain, we feel some kind of epicritic tendency, we feel like withdrawing ourselves somewhere, and we feel like being only some kind of kernel of physical pain. And when we feel good, then we have the feeling of being one with the universe, of expanding, and this is then the protopathic tendency. And it was funny that I can't find examples of sweating, because this is actually the effect of vessel dilatation and vasoconstriction. But sweat is not really an academic subject in philosophy. All right, then let's speak about these two mechanisms. I learned a lot from biology about this mechanism, but I'm not a biologist, so I can only take this rough material and try to reinterpret them. And that's why I tried to make a connection with Hermann Schmidt. It's fascinating that we have so many bodily phenomena which we disconsidered actually in the past for different reasons, asceticism, puritanism, all kinds of reasons, but they make our bodies so we cannot survive, we cannot exist without this mechanism. And more than that, this mechanism connects us once again with the animal world. And that's why I think it's worth meditating on or reflecting also on the mechanism of a sweat. This is not, let's say, something new I bring, but maybe the only innovative thing I bring is encouragement actually to expand our fields of corporeal phenomena we should reflect on. Another thing regarding aura. I work a lot with etymologists because I made my second PhD on Heidegger, and Heidegger uses lots of etymologies. And at the beginning, aura, I think it was in early modernity when it was used for the first time, it was related to the odor. And that's why I use, for example, aura, this concept, as an aesthetic philosophical concept for the first time in relation to an aesthetics of olfaction, that smells, that perfumes, fragrances have an aura. And now I use actually the same concept, but to thermic, let's say thermic perception, or to the thermic subject, because it has to do with irradiation or emanation of warmth, of, let's say, caloric energy, if we want to use some kind of scientific terms. And in addition to the philosophical implications of rediscovering thermic perception or bringing it to the fore, very important are also the implications or the consequences for aesthetics, for the aesthetic theory. Because I told you, so I wrote on tactile aesthetics, olfactory aesthetics, gustatory aesthetics. Then I'm still interested in a multisensory aesthetic experience. And regarding the thermic aesthetics, we do have in our everyday life and in different kinds of arts, we have thermic experiences, but they were disconsidered or they were subordinated to the visual experience. So think of the experience of temperature, the experience of architecture. So we have multisensory experiences both in natural and in artificial settings. So why particular details of architecture are relevant in countries with a hot climate? So how the earth circulates, how you can find protection from heat or protection from coldness. So all these elements are crucial actually for the, let's say, for the success, for the practical value of a work of architecture. And I think it would be bizarre to say that the aesthetic value of a work of architecture is different from its practical value. Because if something looks nice, the facade looks nice, but you cannot live in that building, then I think that this work is somehow compromised. So the thermic aesthetics is crucial or more important, so depending on the kind of arts, in practical arts. The same goes for design, think of clothes or some kind of objects we have to handle, a pot of hot tea and so on, or when we cook. I don't think this is merely and exclusively the visual. Getting back to perfumery, why do we call some fragrances refreshing, fresh, something is fresh? And of course, you can then find some biological or quasi-biological explanations, intermodal associations between the thermic experience and the olfactory experience, or in the case of literature, where you can find the thermic experience in literature. It's only imagined. So this is, of course, more indirect compared to the experience of a natural environment or to the experience of architecture. But then there are different arts, performative arts, with which I actually started my chapter on thermic aesthetics, on warming aesthetics, that require more or less optimal conditions for practicing, for doing physical exercise. So sportsmen know that, but the same goes, of course, for dancers. And once again, let me criticize this history of the obsession with visuality, because for a long time we said, okay, in the case of dance, it's important how it looks like. It's not important whether the dancers have pain or are in pain because of their movements. And it's not important for us spectators or onlookers where they feel comfortable depending on the physical atmosphere, depending on the temperature, if they perform something outdoors or indoors. So let's say that we as spectators lacked empathy so far. But we can expand this thinking of objects, works of art, which are, of course, artifacts and need some conditions to be preserved, which means they need some, of course, technical conditions. These are not objects of a philosophical interpretation, but without guaranteeing, securing these conditions, we cannot be or we cannot become subjects of an aesthetic experience. We cannot look at them because they would be destroyed. So there are different layers. I can think also of film, but most examples I bring come from contemporary art. We can think also of music or theater. So I think that we need a very differentiate interpretation of the meaning and of the relevance of temperature in different kinds of art. So you're not supposed to say that thermic experience is crucial in every art. This was not my claim, but try to integrate also this kind of experience in our general aesthetic theory and then make distinction between different arts, which means different artistic media. And regarding contemporary art, so the so-called fine arts, I discovered an additional challenge for this theory because once again, it's not about mimesis. It's not about the mimetic dimension, the iconic dimension of reproducing. How are you going to reproduce actually temperature? How are you going to show the heat or the coldness? You can only suggest that, and this means appeal to imagination, but not more than that. But especially in contemporary art, we discuss about the art after the end of representation. And I think that artists who try to use thermic perception, to use temperature, for example, to form or deform materials, need, I don't say a completely new aesthetic theory, but we have to adapt to accommodate our traditional aesthetic concepts to these new, let's say, experiments. Because it's not a school, there are only experiments, all kinds of experiments, how you can use temperature, how you can use warmth to produce new images or to produce new experiences.
Thank you so much, Mădălina, and thank you for opening our eyes to understanding how the thermic operates in different spaces and places. Thanks to Mădălina Diaconu for sharing her thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine. The Subverse is produced for us by Tushar Das. A special thank you to Julian Way, who helped me record at Kumquat Studio, and Daniel Schwenger for helping organize this. So long, and thanks for listening.